Shazam is one of my most anticipated comic book movies of the upcoming years, and a film I think will offer a much needed change of pace in the DC film series. But it's shocking to think that it's taken until now for a Shazam movie to actually come to fruition, especially when you think of just how long the iconic character has existed for. In this video, I want to discuss the behind-the-scenes history of the former Captain Marvel, the major adversity faced by his creators, and the incredible journey the character has undertaken in order to get in a position where a live-action adaptation is not only a possibility, but a highly anticipated reality. I find it somewhat astounding that Shazam is actually one of the oldest remaining comic book characters still in regular publication, only outlasted by his fellow DC heroes, Superman and Batman. The character, originally known as Captain Marvel, was created in late 1939 by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck for Fawcett Comics, who, after the breakout success of DC's Superman the previous year, sought to capitalise on this trend with their own larger-than-life superhero. The result of this was Billy Batson, a young orphan boy who, when granted the power of 6 immortal elders, transformed into an incredible superhero. Debuting in issue 2 of Whiz Comics, Shazam became a huge success immediately, his debut issue selling over 500,000 copies and placing himself alongside Superman and Batman as one of the most beloved comic book characters of the time. Throughout the Golden Age, Shazam maintained this level of popularity too, often outselling Superman for a notable period of time, and even receiving the first ever live-action film of any superhero, with Republic Pictures producing a 12-episode serial in 1941 entitled The Adventures of Captain Marvel. By 1944, Shazam's solo title, Captain Marvel Adventures, was selling close to 14 million copies a year, a feat so incredible that the book's cover page actually boasted being the largest circulation of any comic magazine. Captain Marvel was on his way to becoming the most popular hero in the world, so what happened? With the incredible levels of success the character experienced during the Golden Age, it is somewhat strange to think that Shazam today isn't quite viewed by general audiences in the same way as Batman, Superman and Wonder Woman are, who have gone on to become the very faces of the entire genre. And one of the main reasons for this was due to the severe legal battles that Fawcett faced over the characters, which would eventually drive the character out of publication for almost 2 decades. In 1941, DC Comics sued both Fawcett Comics and Republic Pictures for copyright infringement, claiming that Captain Marvel was heavily based on Superman. This legal dispute lasted in litigation for 7 years, before finally being taken to court in 1948. The ensuing battle was incredibly complicated and drawn out. Originally, the court ruled in 1951 that while Captain Marvel was an infringement upon the Superman character, DC had actually also been negligent in their copyright of several of the Superman newspaper strips, and therefore had little ground for a lawsuit against Fawcett. Now, DC ultimately appealed this verdict in 1951, with Judge Leonard Hand ultimately reversing the court's initial decision, arguing that despite DC's failures to copyright several of the aforementioned strips, their copyright over the character remained valid, and Captain Marvel's status as an infringement upon Superman was sadly reaffirmed. It's important to note that by 1952, the year where Judge Hand delivered his verdict, superhero comics had begun to saw their sales rapidly decline, so much so that Fawcett decided that it wasn't worthwhile to continue fighting a legal battle against DC, and instead of retrying the case, attempted to settle out of court. In the end, Fawcett agreed to permanently cease publication of the Captain Marvel character, alongside paying DC $400,000 in damages. As you can imagine, this dealt a heavy blow to the company, ultimately causing Fawcett to shut down its comics division entirely in autumn 1953, and as a result, Shazam was left in the wilderness to be forgotten. By the time that the Silver Age of comics was in full swing in the mid-1960s, Captain Marvel had evaporated from the public consciousness almost entirely, the face of a company which barely even existed anymore. DC had been revitalised after the reintroduction of The Flash and Green Lantern, alongside the debut of the new Justice League series, and Marvel Comics had emerged as a major competitor, introducing the world to new heroes such as the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man and the X-Men. And as a result of this, the comic book industry began to experience a new wave of success. And in a somewhat ironic turn of events, it was Marvel's resurgence during this time that actually led to Shazam's return. Formerly known as both Timely and Atlas Comics, Marvel took on the most well-known name in 1961, 8 years after Captain Marvel was forced to cease publication. With the new identity intact, Marvel began to trademark many different phrases which included their company name, and since Fawcett were no longer printing new Captain Marvel stories, the trademark to the Captain Marvel name was acquired by Marvel Comics in 1967. In order to retain said trademark, all Marvel had to do was publish a Captain Marvel title at least once every 2 years, and as a result created the Kree-born superhero Mar-Vell in December of that same year. With Marvel Comics emerging as a real challenger to DC during the mid-60s and beyond, it ultimately led DC to begin searching for new heroes to pop sales in the same way Marvel's had. Acclaimed producer Michael Uslan perhaps describes what happens next the best, noting that in 1972 or 73, when sales of Superman weren't so great, DC turned to Fawcett and said, "Hey, you can't do anything with this character without our permission under the terms of the settlement, so how about licensing the character to us and we'll publish it?" Fawcett agreed, and the Captain Marvel character was then licensed over to DC Comics, bringing an end to 19 years in the comic book wasteland. However, with the aforementioned copyright obtained by Marvel Comics several years earlier, DC realised a problem. While they still could publish new stories featuring the Captain Marvel character, they were unable to title the book Captain Marvel, ultimately choosing to title their new series Shazam after the hero's iconic catchphrase, with DC publisher Carmine Infantino adding the subtitle The Original Captain Marvel. This, though, was removed by issue 15 of the series dated December 1974, after DC received a cease and desist letter from Marvel, with further issues of the series instead marketed as The World's Mightiest Mortal. Regardless though, there was a real sense of excitement and anticipation towards Shazam's return to print, with many comic fans eager to finally read about a character that had become somewhat of an urban myth. Acclaimed comic book writer Mark Waid describes this sentiment. He recalled, "That was what got me into the character, the hoopla that came with the relaunch of Shazam in 1972. I had read the great comic book heroes with the one page on Captain Marvel, legally that was all you could do, and I was intrigued by the character. Aside from the character himself, people wanted to see this character who had all this legal stuff behind him and know what the hype was about." And the first few issues of Shazam tried to echo this sentiment, appearing almost like a lost series of comics recovered from the Golden Age, partly aided to the return of artist and co-creator C.C. Beck. And while this appeared to be a brilliant notion, in execution it didn't garner the same success as DC would have hoped. While the promise of a Golden Age style comic in the early 1970s appeared to be a nice change of pace, contemporary comic books had begun to cater to a slightly older audience, predominantly college-age readers, with heavy doses of social commentary and culturally relevant themes. Think Marvel Spider-Man, or even Denny O'Neil, the first writer on this new Shazam series, work on Green Arrow. And this created a problem. As Michael Uslan describes, Captain Marvel got caught in the wrong age at the wrong time, and it wasn't working for the people who were buying comic books. The comic shops were getting underway, distribution was in flux, it was hard to get comics in the hands of kids who could appreciate a cartoony Billy Batson. Failure to adapt to the current climate would have made Shazam come across as very dated and unexciting to contemporary readers, with the novelty of a Golden Age character not bound to last forever. Despite this, Shazam's co-creator C.C. Beck actively fought against any attempts to update the character. Elliot Maggin, who took over writing duties from O'Neil, described how, when Beck wanted to do the series, Carmine Infantino and Julius Schwartz jumped on it, because if they were going to do the book with him, we were going to have to do it fantastically. And that was the decision point when he came on. And he didn't work out. He changed scripts, he made changes in storylines that were very strange, and he would give us notes on our scripts, telling us how to format our scripts better. Eventually, Beck's refusal to allow Shazam to be modernised, mixed with his frequent clashes with DC editorial, led to the artist's exit from the title by issue 10, dated February 1974. Beck remained bitter towards Captain Marvel's return to print largely until his death in 1989, writing in 1987 that DC had sought to intentionally destroy his character. He wrote that they were trying to kill Captain Marvel, bury him, and drive a stake through his lifeless body. Now at last, they have succeeded. And only 4 years after Beck's exit from the series, DC cancelled Shazam entirely after the release of issue 35 in June 1978, after a continued decline in sales. Shazam had managed to cheat death once, but a second time would have been near impossible to return from. As the 1970s became the 80s, there was little talk of DC actually bringing Captain Marvel back, with editorial resigned to the supposed failure of their previous relaunch. And it appeared that Beck's assertion had come true. Shazam had been killed off by DC for the second time in his life. So how did Shazam come back from this second stint in the wasteland and return to the forefront of the DC universe? Well, it's actually quite simple. DC decided to kill their entire universe and virtually start over again. In 1985, DC released their limited series Crisis on Infinite Earths, a huge universe-spanning crossover which promised to change the entire landscape of the DC Comics multiverse. This story ushered in a new age for the company, with most comics released thereafter defined as either being pre-crisis or post-crisis. And while the implications of this series is a video in itself, one thing that it did do was finally fold Shazam in to the main DC universe. You see, prior to the release of this series, it had been established that all of Shazam's stories, both before and after the character had been licensed to DC Comics, didn't take place on the same Earth as the rest of DC's stories, instead occurring on the parallel Earth S. In the aftermath of Crisis, where all of the different alternate versions of Earth were merged, leaving behind one singular continuity, Shazam and his related characters found themselves living in a world populated by other heroes, meaning that 3 decades after being forced out of publication and discarded as a Superman clone, Shazam now could share the sky with the Man of Steel. From this point onwards, DC attempted to rework elements of the Shazam character in order to make him a perfect fit within their existing comic book universe. Perhaps the most notable of these changes came in 1987 as part of Roy and Dan Thomas's revived origin series Shazam: The New Beginning. In this story, it's established for the first time that when Billy transforms into Captain Marvel, he actually retains the mind and personality of his younger self, with this trait becoming a defining part of the Shazam character thereafter. This idea of building the Shazam character around Billy's youthful nature was expanded further in the 1990s. After DC officially purchased the rights to Shazam from Fawcett, Jerry Ordway penned the graphic novel The Power of Shazam in 1994. This series placed a heavy focus on Billy's teenage life and the relatable problems that he faced. As Ordway explained, "I gave Billy all the problems Peter Parker had, back when he was in high school. That was my goal. If Fawcett hadn't stopped publishing the book, they would have had to have adapted to the times somehow. You would have had your silly period, but I think they would have rolled with it and done what Marvel was doing in the 1960s. However, where this story perhaps comes full circle the best was in 1996, when writer Mark Waid, who was first introduced to Shazam upon his initial resurrection by DC, released his seminal graphic novel Kingdom Come, an out-of-continuity story detailing a future wherein the classic DC heroes were forced into retirement with the emergence of immoral and dangerously irresponsible new heroes. Kingdom Come served as Wade's love letter to the classic golden age of comics, in the midst of the overly dark and extreme stories which dominated the 1990s, and in his mind, Shazam represented the best of what a superhero should be, ultimately having a prominent role within the book. Most notably, the conclusion of Kingdom Come saw a now adult Billy Batson ultimately sacrifice himself to save a world at the brink of destruction, with his torn off cape serving as a fitting memorial for the hero, and a symbol of hope and optimism to the new world, just as it had done for legions of comic book fans decades prior. And now in 2018, Shazam has not only been firmly entrenched as a permanent member of the DC universe, but became a prominent and central figure within it. After the company's New 52 relaunch in 2011, Shazam was granted both a new series by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, within the backups to the company's Justice League series, but soon after became a member of the iconic superhero team, priming the hero for his return to the big screen some 78 years after the premiere of his breakthrough serial. And it's truly astounding to see how far this character has come, after cheating certain death on more than one occasion, to now being the property that DC hopes will win back audiences at the box office. Not only that, but the sheer sense of irony that Shazam, a character known around the world as Captain Marvel, was brought back to life by the company who spent 2 decades trying to destroy him, only as a way to compete with Marvel Comics, makes this one of the greatest comeback stories in the history of comics. Despite their early attempts to wipe away Shazam's existence, DC managed to not only house the character, but truly gift him a new home, one where he's been able to thrive, succeed, and inspire new generations of fans in the same way he did to those in the Golden Age. And with his aforementioned big screen adaptation currently one of my most anticipated superhero movies of next year, I think it's right to not only acknowledge where Shazam has been and what he's overcame, but also celebrate where he'll go in the future, as long as audiences continue to show their support for this beloved superhero and say the magic word. Hey everyone, thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts were about this video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and maybe check out one of the other similar videos on screen that you might also enjoy if you enjoyed this one. You can find a written version of this video on my website, owenlikescomics.com, along with a host of other written articles and lists and things that you might also enjoy. You can follow me on Twitter at owenlikescomics, and that's all for me. I will see you all next time. So until then, take care and keep reading.